Hello and welcome to Tomlin's Harmonica podcast, where I'll be hanging out with players and teachers and having conversations loosely based around harmonica. You probably know this week's guest as the author of the best-selling instructional books Harmonica for Dummies and Blues Harmonica for Dummies, but there's so much more to the story than that. He's comfortable playing diatonic and chromatic across a wide variety of genres, including blues, jazz, and French, Canadian, Scottish folk. He's been described by Jason Ricci as a mad scientist of harmonicas and harmonica music. He is none other than Winslow Yerxa. Welcome to the podcast, Winslow. How are you doing?
Fine, thanks, and thank you for having me, Tomlin.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. Whereabouts are you based?
I'm based in San Francisco, California.
Nice. And you were saying before we started recording that you've been able to enjoy a little bit of actual social time in the middle of COVID. How's that been?
Well, it's been fine. I mean, people here mask up. They do all the proper things. And we're not that hard hit. Of course, California, having a large population, has large numbers, but the rates are relatively low. And, I've been able to live my life. I go to the grocery store early in the morning so I don't have to line up. Can't play gigs. That's probably the biggest thing. Mm-hmm. All of my teaching has moved online, and that works fine. Those are the major things, really.
Yeah. Yeah, the no gigging thing has been difficult, I think, for everyone. Are you finding that you're getting that kind of slightly weird itch of I've not been on stage in a while and I need to go and express myself?
Well, it would be nice. I was actually just getting back into gigging when this all came down. And, I was getting offers, come and play on my gig, we'd like to book you, all that stuff. And then boom, it all just stops, just as I was ramping back up. So hopefully in not too distant future that will start to happen again.
Yeah, no, I hope it will, and I'm sure that there'll still be the desire to see people playing live. I know that a lot of my students are getting that kind of sort of hitting a brick wall because they've been practicing for a while and they're not seeing the improvement. And normally, what I would suggest to kind of get you out of that sensation of not being sure why you're even practicing is go to a gig and watch someone play and get inspired. And I can't say that at the moment, so I'm hoping that we get to do that soon.
Yeah. It's not the same playing for a camera in a virtual concert.
No, it's really not. And I think, it's one thing if you're playing by yourself. If you can play at least with another musician in the same room as you, that automatically is a million times more pleasant, and you get that interaction and someone listening to you in real time. And yeah, I miss that as well. So have you found that lockdown's been an opportunity to work on new things?
Well, to some extent it has, yes. It seems like I'm always busy anyway. Right now we're just doing some final touches on repackaging. It's not really new editions of the Dummies books. They're just refreshing the look of them, but at the same time, refreshing web links to get rid of websites that might have gone away or new things that should be included. So it's kind of a minor dust off, but it still tends to require more work than one might think. And refreshing the covers and making sure that the right things are said on the cover, all of that sort of thing.
Yeah, I can imagine that maybe working with quite a big publisher, the timelines must be quite extended, and it must be a while to kind of get things moving. Is that right?
Well, it has been slowed some. Now, that particular publisher tends to work on very tight schedules.
Okay.
It's not like you get a book advance and then you go sit on the beach in Mexico for 6 months and write your magnum opus. It's like they say, okay, you have to deliver a quarter of the page count this month, another quarter next month. So it's a 4 months process to write a 300+ page book.
Wow.
So it's a production line.
Yeah, that's a big chunk.
It's pretty intensive. And now this isn't what's going on here, but still they're pushing me for stuff so that they can get it into the September mix. Basically, the fall book release period is very important because then that goes into Christmas sales. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So that's what we're aiming towards.
Very cool. And your books are among the, I think I read that they're in the top 5 of the best-selling Dummies books overall, which I thought was awesome that Harmonica is up there.
Well, they were early on. I'm not sure where they are now. And of course, there are always newer, cheaper harmonica books coming out as well. Uh, and people do buy on price, unfortunately. Um, so I'd actually thought of coming up with something much shorter and maybe self-publishing um, to compete on price. And then I thought, do I really want to go to that effort? Especially because the book business, I mean, people aren't buying books like they once did.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I have those thoughts every once in a while of, why aren't I self-publishing, but why aren't other people self-publishing? Because there's virtually zero barrier to entry to putting a book out there. But yeah, as you say, are people actually buying books like they used to?
Well, a physical book means physical objects. It means inventory. It means shipping. It means all of those things, which are rather inconvenient. You could put a book in PDF format or Kindle. Kindle has a lot of limitations. But then there's the problem of duplicability. Mm-hmm. Because once something's in a downloadable form, it's also very easily pirated.
Absolutely.
So there's that as well.
Yeah. I guess you're as you said, you're a very busy person, and I was looking at kind of things that you work on in general and how they've transitioned a little bit in recent times. And you run the Harmonica Collective with Jason Ricci, don't you?
Yes, and we've got our producer Tom Watson as well.
Very cool. But you've moved that on to online workshops, haven't you?
Well, we've had to.
Yeah.
We were going to do one in March, but then COVID came down and we couldn't do that. And it's a blast to do that. Again, it's like live music. Mm-hmm. It's really wonderful to interact directly with people, with our colleagues, with other musicians, with the students. So what we're doing now is we're interviewing basically the cream of harmonica players and people in related fields. We've done Charlie Musselwhite. That one went really well last month. Magic Dick, Mark Hummel. And we're working on, I can't announce yet because we haven't got it confirmed yet, but we're looking at working with someone who's not only a great player, but a great customizer.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. So it sounds like you're maybe doing them more regularly than you would be doing the kind of live in-person events.
Well, we're doing them every month, first Sunday of each month. And again, because it's all online, there isn't the logistical stuff. Mm-hmm. That would go into producing a live event, which we've only ever done really once a year. We were thinking of doing it twice a year, and that might come up in the future, depending on, of course, pandemic situation.
Yeah, it's all about that, isn't it?
Now.
Is there a way? Are the students able to kind of get the interaction that they would in an in-person event with the online ones?
Yes, I mean, it's at times a bit awkward, partly because of latency. Sometimes people's microphones tend to cut off a note that's sustained after a certain amount of time. They've got some kind of a noise gate. Uh-huh. That may be in the computer itself, or it may be actually in the app like Skype, because all of these things are based on the idea that speech is the main medium. Mm-hmm. So when you have a sustained tone, I mean, nobody speaks in long, long vowels. So those don't seem to be part of the setup. So there are little inconveniences like that, but mostly it works fine. I mean, you can't see the entire person necessarily. You can't see what they're doing with their abdomen. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, you can, but you have to kind of move around relative to the camera. Most people are in this sort of tight, shoulders up sort of visible format. Mm-hmm. And we need to see more than that, of course, to teach a breathing-based instrument. But again, these are just things that are easy to work around.
Yeah. And also, I think that, it's still very early days of getting people online. Like I was chatting to Joe Falisco for the podcast last month, and he was kind of saying that he'd never done Instagram Live, he'd never done Zoom, he'd never done Skype, and then he'd done all three in the same day, and it was kind of just a huge revelation. So I think as we go further on, people are going to get slicker and slicker at doing it, and people will probably get better at filming themselves, and it'll get kind of more of an immersive experience.
Well, we're kind of being pushed into it by circumstances, and I think that's going to leave its mark.
Hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
before it was like, oh yeah, that exists. Do I really want to get involved? Right? I'd rather do what I know. But now we're being forced to know new things and try new paths, and I think it'll be a positive result overall.
Yeah, I think it's kind of the introvert's kind of ultimate setup, because I think I've had a lot of students in the past say that they don't want to come to in-person events because they find it quite scary. And I totally get that. I find, if I go as a customer or a student to one of those kind of things, it is quite scary. And the idea that you can do it from the comfort of your own home must be quite liberating if you're feeling quite introverted.
Yeah. Well, another thing that we're doing, this is a different SPA, the Society for the Preservation and Advancement of the Harmonica. Again, we have an annual 5-day convention in early August, and usually with about 500 people in attendance. And of course, again, we've had to take that online. So now we've got SPA Week, and we're still going to have entertainers giving concerts. We're still going to have seminar presenters. We're still going to do our award ceremony. We obviously won't be able to serve dinner at the Saturday night banquet, but we're finding ways to do all of this stuff. And I think it will draw potentially a much wider audience because people don't have to travel and pay for a hotel and so forth. What we'll miss again, though, is that, you stumble out of your hotel room at 4 a.m. and somebody's doing something really cool, which actually does happen quite a lot.
Oh yeah, I've seen so many videos of completely ridiculous setups of, like here's Jason Ricci hanging out with Will Wilde and they're having this crazy jam at, as you say, 4 a.m, and it's it's very cool. I'd actually been planning on coming to SPA this year, and obviously it's not going to happen this year, but I'm hoping that next year we'll be able to get over there, and I'm hoping that people can travel full stop.
Yeah. Well, I'm hoping that too, and I certainly look forward to seeing you there, should we all be able to be in attendance.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's move away from kind of current times and the Harmonica Collective and SPA, which I've made notes of in the show notes below, so I encourage people go and check them out. And I'm really excited that you're moving SPA online. That's a really big deal, and actually something I was going to ask you about. So that's good. You've already answered that question. But yeah, let's go back a little bit to how you got started playing harmonica.
Well, I was 14 going on 15 years old and singing in a garage band. And I didn't play an instrument at that point. And I had built an electric kazoo. Well, my mother had worked as a young woman as a telephone operator, and she still had these headphones, which were high impedance. And instead of a speaker cone, it had a metal disc, which was screwed down by the earpiece. And if you loosened it, the disc would rattle, and because it was high impedance, you could use it as a microphone, and that would create the buzz that the membrane on a kazoo would do. So I used to hum harmonica parts into this electric kazoo. And after a while, I started feeling silly, and I thought, gee, maybe I should just get a harmonica. And mostly what I was hearing was blues-based harmonica from British blues rock bands like Cream, Rolling Stones, people like that. And just dribs and drabs of it here and there. And so at school, I asked a fellow who played, what should I get? And he said, get a C harp. I didn't tell him that I was trying to play a tune in the key of E, which was Cream's version of Spoonful, but the harmonica solo was just the notes E and G, which you can play on, just in hole 2 of a C harmonica. So I did that for a while, but then I noticed that when he was playing Train Time, also in E, on an A harp, the chords that he was playing I couldn't get on a C harmonica. I thought, why do the chords sound weird? And thus began the cognitive dissonance that has led me forward through life, trying to figure out this strange instrument and all the delightful and odd things that it does.
That's awesome. I mean, the idea of the electric kazoo. I'm a little bit sad that you picked up harmonica when you had such an imaginative first instrument, but I'm also very glad that you did, because you've gone very far with it.
Thanks.
But you also got quite into chromatic quite early on as well, didn't you?
I did. When my mother saw that I was interested in harmonica, she thought, "Oh, let's get you a chromatic." She'd probably heard, that's the real instrument. I mean, she didn't look down her nose at the diatonic. So we went to the music store, and at first they didn't have a proper solo tune chromatic in stock. They had the Koch 980, which is the one that's tuned like a diatonic and is valveless. So I got that, and then later I decided, okay, I could see why that was limited, and although that was interesting to play as well. So I got a 64. Now back then, um, a Marine band, and this is Canadian money, which is worth slightly less. Well, it depends on circumstances, but generally a bit less than U.S. money. A Marine band was $3.25. That 10-hole chromatic was like $10. The 12-hole, which, the Hohner 270 was the only thing available then, that was $15, and a 64, the big 16-holer, was $20.
Wow.
I mean, even given the difference in the value of money between then and now, that was still a pretty good deal. But German currency was still fairly depressed in the post-war period, even though the war had been over for 20 some odd years at that point. A few years later, the Deutschmark started its meteoric rise, and of course now it's the euro, and prices are rather different from what they were when I started.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, I still think that harmonica is a very democratic instrument in terms of pricing, but it's not quite that democratic anymore. That's amazing. It sounds like your mum was really enthusiastic about fostering musicality in you. Was she musical?
She was. She played the piano and sang. I guess she'd had some classical training, but she made a point of, she would tell a story about how her father would like to show his daughters off as musicians to guests. And now he was a clergyman. He was a Anglican priest, and so everything was proper. And she would get up and play some jaunty little pop tune just to kind of annoy him. But sometimes the guests enjoyed that rather than a staid recitation of the golden classic stuff that everybody thought should be the approved way of expressing oneself musically. So she had a little bit of the rebellious streak in her that way. But yes, the family's quite musical.
That definitely helps. So you're learning diatonic and chromatic simultaneously, and right now, personally, I find that completely amazing just because I've only picked up chromatic in the last month. And it's kind of working for me, but it's also hurting my brain a little bit just because there's a lot of muscle memory and ways of playing that I can't immediately translate to chromatic. How was it learning both simultaneously? What were the kind of advantages of that?
Well, one thing that I notice is that I don't seem to have a problem with different sizes of harmonica, different spacing and sizes of holes, different interfaces between the mouth and the harmonica, because I've played so many different kinds. Sometimes I see people, especially beginners, say, "Oh, this model does this and this model does that." And to me, they're tiny differences. Mm-hmm. And I think that as a player progresses, the similarities between different harmonicas come to the fore, and all those little differences kind of recede into the background. But at first, they seem enormous to a lot of people when they start to play. I didn't experience that. Between the 10-hole quasi-chromatic, the 16-hole huge chromatic, and the standard-sized diatonic. And I remember I actually had a 5-hole little lady.
Cool.
Now, it's usually a 4-hole instrument. But for some reason, I walked into a music store and they had a 5-hole one, a Hohner. And Hohner made a lot of different harmonicas that vanished over time. And I remember there was a lot of new old stock in music stores when I started to play. I remember going into a store and they had a Larry Adler chromatic in the silver box. Oh. And it was a 16-hole chromatic. And the sales guy actually tried to dissuade me from buying it. He said, "No, it's the same harp as the regular 64, and it costs more money. Why buy that? Just, buy the cheaper one." And I said, "No, I want this one." I liked it. It was actually one of the best chromatics I've ever played. Unfortunately, I lost it a few months later. I left it in a taxi cab, I think, and it was gone. And I suspect, I don't remember the details at this distance in time, that what I might have gotten was an old straight-tuned wood-bodied harmonica. There was just a lot of new old stock still floating around in music stores. But learning chromatic and diatonic at the same time, I really did focus more on diatonic initially. And I would play chromatic to imitate what little Walter was doing when he played third position chromatic. And it wasn't until I got a 12-hole chromatic that I really started playing it as a melody instrument. Because something about that smaller format just seemed to invite focusing on single note playing rather than those big chord washes with, all the tongue blocked effects the third position blues chromatic really encourages. And that wasn't until a few years later. And I started to sort of more open up. Also, hearing players like, certainly Toots Thielemens was an eye-opener. And Larry Adler. I remember hearing him as a teenager and being astounded that he could change so completely, phrase by phrase, the tone color of the instrument. Now it would sound like a flute, now like a violin, now like something else. So I had good models for chromatic in my ear. Also, although I didn't know it at the time, Tommy Riley. Tommy Riley, as you may know, is a Canadian who settled in the UK after the war and had a career as a classical harmonica virtuoso. Made many recordings of the classical harmonica repertoire. A lot of it was St. Martin in the Fields. But he also was the harmonica on the theme music to a children's program in Canada called Chez Hélène, where this woman, Hélène Bayarchon, who I later learned was actually a very respected folklorist and singer, would be this sort of mid-40s housewife who spoke only French, the neighbor girl who would drop by who spoke only English, and a puppet mouse, and I don't remember what language the mouse spoke, but it was an it was an effort to encourage bilingualism in Canadian children. And theme music was this harmonica theme that I took to be French-Canadian music. Many years later, I was able to finally locate it, and it was actually a production company that Tommy Riley and another fellow owned that would produce library music, pre-recorded music that could then be adapted for whatever commercial purpose. And he used a pseudonym for this as well, maybe in order not to sully his image as a serious classical musician. And you can actually find it on iTunes now. But when I finally heard it again, I immediately recognized that it was him. And with his amazingly good tone and command of blending throat and hand vibrato, all of the wonderful things about his playing. And I realized I had a very good model very early. Not that I can play like him, but having good models, I think, is really essential to one's development as a player. Hearing Little Walter and the Sonny Boys and all of those great blues players for diatonic models, I think is very, very important. And often younger people, I've noticed with my students, will come to harmonica from hearing like a current rock or blues rock band with a player who's good, but not like those really great players. So, I mean, it's good. Well, just like I got into it from hearing Jack Bruce and Steve Winwood. If I listen to their playing now, I think, yeah, okay. But at the time, that really drew me in. And that's great that happens. But then once that does happen, hearing the really, really great players gets the possibilities and the depth of the instrument into your ear.
No doubt. And I think that I probably fall into that category of people who I didn't even pick up harmonica because I wanted to sound like any particular harmonica player. I literally just had to take a break from guitar due to injury and wanted an instrument that I could play. So I just wanted to play guitar lines on a harmonica, and then, weirdly got into this career that I've gotten into, and then discovered the greats. And I was like, wow, there are so many great sounds that I had no idea existed. So I've had the kind of reverse discovery of the greats that it took me far too long to get to. I only recently started listening to William Clark, which I think a lot of people will think is sacrilege that it took me so long.
Well, I mean, you find what you find when you find it.
Yeah.
There's no shame in that. I mean, it's a wonderful thing to discover great players.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'm very curious because I'm working on chromatic at the moment. I'm curious as to how you visualize diatonic and chromatic and whether there's a difference between the two. So, for example, the thing that I'm thinking about at the moment is diatonic. I very much visualize in terms of intervals. I don't think about actual notes. I think about the intervals that I'm playing. Whereas chromatic, I'm coming at it more from an idea of it being almost like a piano, and so I'm trying to make a concerted effort to visualize actual letters rather than intervals. How does that kind of compare to how you visualize?
I combine the two approaches. I mean, I think intervallically. I think in terms of relationships. It's sort of like you've got a formula, and if you know the value of x, the formula will populate all the other values. You know, if x happens to be C, and this formula is a C major scale, boom, all of the notes just kind of fall into place. Mind you, I've memorized all of the scales. I did that as a teenager. It's sort of like learning your multiplication tables at school. You know, once you know it, and you don't have to think about it all that much. I'm lucky that way. I have that kind of mind, and I know not everyone does. And you know, you have to use different approaches with different people. But in the case of the chromatic, I still think intervallically. Now, I do play different keys of chromatic sometimes. You know, C is my default instrument, but I have other keys that I use, and it helps to be able to think intervallically, because that way you're not all of a sudden stumped by the fact that in this particular place you've got a D instead of a C or whatever it happens to be. So it's a bit of a combination. I suppose by default I think of it as a C instrument. And for instance, one sometimes will hear voiced or read written, I suppose, on some chromatic forums that why should we have tab for chromatic, or even why should we talk about positions? You're playing in C, you're playing in F, or whatever, you know. Well, if you're playing different keys of chromatic, then it does help to think about positions. Tab, of course, is useful, although I've really tried to move a lot of my chromatic students away from it and towards notation. You know, tab will slow you down if you really want to start reading music, because you tend to look below to the arrows and numbers instead of to the staff. And I find I do the opposite. I look at the staff. I don't want to look at tab personally, but it's very useful in teaching. So, yeah, I combine the intervallic approach and the fixed pitch approach, shall we say. It's sort of like there are two ways of teaching ear training and sight singing in music academies. There's fixed do and movable do. And movable do is whatever the tonic note is. You know, if you're in the key of C, C is do. If you're in the key of F, F is do. Whereas in the fixed do system, do is always C. Like in French, they don't call the note C, D, E, F. They're do, re, mi, fa, and that do actually is C. And if you're in the key of F, well, fa is your home. You know, so it's two different approaches there, and that's kind of a parallel to what we see with what you're talking about in diatonic versus chromatic. Because you have different keys of diatonic, it's very useful to think intervallically in a sort of a movable do system. With chromatic, again, there are different keys of chromatic, but it is probably helpful, it certainly is if you're using just a C chromatic, to think of actual note names. Now, the way to bridge them might be to say, okay, I know this interval structure for the key of C, so let me just map that onto the chromatic. Right? And if you know that interval system, and then you know the note names that occur when you apply that interval system to this key, right, then you're in the place you need to be in. And then you just need to fill in the little bits in between where the black keys are. Yeah. The other thing, though, about that, let me talk about the black keys. A thing that I often encounter with people, and sometimes with very experienced chromatic players, is they think of the slide-in notes as sharp. And they have trouble thinking about flats. Now, if you look at a piano keyboard, that black key between C and D it's neither one nor the other. It's both, right? It's both C sharp and it's D flat at the same time. It's just a matter of how do you want to spell that note according to whatever other circumstances might make you do one or the other. I've always approached the slide-in notes the same way. Sure, if you press the slide in, the note goes up a semitone, so it's easy to think of it as a sharp. That's a physical thing.
Mm-hmm.
Musical logic is not necessarily physical. Right?
Mm-hmm.
It's logical. In the key of D, you're not going to have a D flat. The note named D is already in use. You're going to have a D and a C sharp. Whereas in the key of A flat, you're going to have a D flat because you're going to use all flats
Mm-hmm.
to define the scale. So I try and think of those. I don't have to try. Me personally, those notes are both. That slide in note when you play the blow note in hole 5 on a chromatic. That's the note that's between C and D.
Mm-hmm.
It's not automatically C sharp. It's not automatically D flat. That'll be determined by whatever else is going on in the music.
Yeah, that's a really useful way to think about it, because I have been struggling with that when I've been wanting to throw in all of my blues notes, and they're all, in my mind, they're all flat notes from, the note that I'm hitting. I want to flatten it, and so that slide to me should be flattening the note, and it's not.
Right. Well, I mean, you can flip the slide over and have a flat slide chromatic, and some people do that so that the note goes down instead of up.
Ah. Oh, wow. You've just thrown me down an interesting path. I feel like I should commit to learning on a standard chromatic harmonica and get round it, but that does sound like a really nice cheat.
Yeah. The thing that happens then, though, is that your default slide out key on a C chromatic is now going to be D flat, let's say, or we can call it C sharp. And then you have to think, okay, do I need to get a different key of chromatic so that my slide out key is C, for instance? And that's its own rabbit hole, so to speak. But I mean, yeah, let's say if you're playing I'll pick up a chromatic here. So that's sort of like the D minor arpeggio. So if I want to play the flat 5, there's it's a draw note with a slide out. So I had to press in the slide and play a blow note. It's not the same thing as where's a D harp, or rather a G harp. You're not going to get that sound because you can bend the note down, but it doesn't sound as cool. Right? You don't get the two reeds interacting the way you do on the diatonic, so it's less of a lively, complex sound, but it's certainly possible. There are a lot of myths about what you can and can't do on the chromatic, and bending is one of them, where people seem to think, you'll damage the chromatic or it doesn't bend very far, neither of which is true. With good bending technique, you do no harm to the reed. And my favorite example of bending on chromatic actually being more flexible is so that's like the opening to Cherry Pink and Apple Blossom White. And I was playing it in C, and when I got to that G note, I bent it all the way down to an E. And it's a blow note. And if you listen to the original Perez Prado recording of it, the trumpet player does the same thing. In fact, he seems to bend it down a lot farther. And Jerry Murad and the Harmonicas would sometimes do that same bend. And this is a stock chromatic. Now, individual instruments do vary a lot in their bendability, but that kind of dispels the myth that you can't bend on a chromatic, or you can't bend as far, or it should only be a semitone or whatever. It's actually far more flexible as a bending instrument. It just doesn't sound as cool. People will sometimes take half the valves, the windsaver valves, off the chromatic so they can get that more diatonic sounding bend. But in so doing, they also severely limit the bending range. It's a trade-off.
Interesting.
You can have flexibility in range, or you can limit the flexibility in range to get a cooler sounding bend.
Okay, so this kind of brings the question to my mind, like what dictates your choice of what you pick up when you're playing?
Sometimes I'll go back and forth. And I might choose a different instrument on a different date. Or even in the same song, I might change instruments, which has a long tradition, certainly. Little Walter did it on some of his records. You hear it from other players as well. George Smith was great that way. he would often trade back and forth, and he would play chromatics in different keys, 12-hole chromatics. You hear it on some country records, and I'll do it from time to time live as well. Or I might play it on one instrument one day and the other instrument the next. It's really a matter of what you feel will express best what the song is saying. Mm-hmm. And I've played in a few musical productions, musical theater productions that have harmonica parts like Big River. And it'll call for this instrument or that instrument. And sometimes I say, no, I think it's better on this other one. This will be better expressed on that instrument. And the composer's not here to look over my shoulder, and the conductor won't know the difference, so I'm going to go with it.
Yeah, no, I think something that has kind of struck me, and it did take a chromatic player saying this to me, but the chromatic harmonica is not a different instrument to diatonic. It's another part of the harmonica player's arsenal, and I've been hiding behind this idea that I don't play chromatic because it's a different instrument, and that's just an excuse not to put the time in to learning the different intervals and kind of locations of things. But I'm coming around to this idea that it's another part of the harmonica player's arsenal, and if you don't have it, you're missing out on so many different extra sounds.
That's a good way to look at it. I mean, it is also useful to think of it as a different instrument in the same family, so that you don't get discouraged by thinking, oh my gosh, if I can play a diatonic, why isn't the chromatic just an easy thing to pick up? It is different, but there are so many similarities, that I think it actually helps to build a bridge from one to the other. I mean, the bass harmonica, that's a very different animal. It's all blow notes, very low pitched. It has a very different response to breath. And I play a little bit of bass as well, and a little bit of chord. And they're all kind of fun to play with, but they have their own sets of requirements.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel that you're one of the rare players who kind of does everything. Technique wise, I might be wrong, but I feel like we were chatting about this a little bit before, but you tongue block and you lip purse, and I think you overblow as well, don't you? And mm-hmm. you kind of you do it all, where a lot of players kind of define themselves as one or other, or a traditionalist or a modern player. Is that something that you try and foster in your students as well?
I try and see where they want to go and use that as a motivator, because people vary a lot. Some people will have absolutely no interest in this or that or whatever. One of the things I had to recognize early on, and I noticed this at spa conventions, is that not everybody wants to be a blues diatonic player. And that very much informed the decisions I made about the initial version of Harmonica for Dummies. I thought this really needs to address a broad base of fundamental technique that's going to serve you no matter what you want to play.
Yeah, I think that's something that I struggle with, because I just teach blues and kind of associated genres, and I'm always surprised when I come across students who come in and say, well, where's all the other stuff? And I'm like, well, for me that's all. Not all harmonica is. For me, it's all music is. I'm very focused on those genres on all instruments that I play. So it's quite eye-opening to realize that actually there's a huge chunk of the population that have no interest in blues whatsoever.
Right. But by the same token, so many people come to it from hearing either blues or blues-influenced music. Often it's rock music that's clearly blues-based. And so, one recognizes that, but always there's the possibility that that's not at all where they're coming from.
No, it's true. That's actually something I wanted to ask you about, because I know that you teach at the jazz school in Berkeley, California, and I'm assuming that means that you're teaching kind of more harmonically complex music on harmonica than a lot of the people listening probably play. Do you find that there's been a kind of increase in people looking to play something that's maybe a little bit more virtuosic?
Well, it depends on what you mean by virtuosic. I mean, you can be virtuosic with very simple chord changes.
Hmm.
And actually, when I was teaching at the jazz school, I mean, we tried different things, but we found that the only thing that consistently drew students was the beginning harmonica class. So again, I would work with the fundamentals of technique, which are the same for any style. Um, and it would have been nice to be able to follow that with, increasing levels of complexity and virtuosity. But generally, we got people started
Hmm.
in those courses, despite the surrounding of, being in the middle of all of that wonderful jazz activity.
I think, yeah, by virtuosic, I'm probably thinking more kind of musically complex. So for me, the idea of playing over changes and playing over more complex changes than a 1/4/5 is something that feels quite alien on a diatonic harmonica. Certainly for me, if I was playing more complex music, I would grab my guitar because it's chromatic easily and I can visualize more. But I feel that I might be wrong, but I feel that I'm seeing more advanced players now playing more advanced, kind of harmonically advanced music.
Definitely, there's an increase in fluency in being able to get around on the diatonic harmonica. I mean, Jason Ricci recently made the crack that there's any number of Russian teenagers on YouTube who can play everything that he plays, uh, which on a technical level might be true. I think that statement's a wee bit hyperbolic, but I certainly understand where he's going. In terms of harmonic complexity, I'm not sure, though. I mean, we're seeing people playing over rock changes, which again aren't that much more complex than blues changes.
Hmm.
You might have a chord here and there that's thrown in from a related key, but mostly it's chords drawn from that basic scale. Um, Even with more harmonically complex music, though, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to find notes that don't want to come out of your harmonica.
Right.
In other words, you can find the notes that work
Hmm.
and then branch out from there.
That
It's sort of like crossing a river that has some stones you can jump from one to the other, and then you maybe get a bit more adventurous and maybe realize you can jump in the water occasionally.
I think that's you've given me a bit of a breakthrough just kind of psychologically about visualizing playing over more complex changes, because yeah, I think I've always felt that if I can play all the notes of an arpeggio or of a whole scale that would fit over a chord, I'd want to be able to do that over every chord in the sequence. But actually, yeah, having a stepping stone of a couple of notes that might be more readily available on the diatonic would probably be seamless to a listener.
Right. Well, okay. Let me pose a theoretical situation, and I apologize to the listeners who may find what I'm about to say puzzling. Let's say you have an A flat major seventh chord, and you have a C harmonica in your hand.
Hmm.
Now, the A flat scale has 4 flat notes in it, none of which are built into the C harmonica. But if I look at that chord, it's got an A flat, then it's got a C, then it's got an E flat, and a G. Well, C and G are both notes in that chord that are on your C harmonica, right?
Hmm.
You can get that A flat by bending draw 3 all the way down or draw 6. The E flat, not so easy. It's an overblow, except maybe in hole 8 where you can bend it down, bend the blow note down. So you've got some possibilities. So maybe you just hang for dear life onto those notes while the raging river of A flat goes by on your C harmonica until you decide, oh, gee, let me try this other note here. Gee, that sounds weird. Maybe if I bend it, it might sound better.
Yeah.
It's sort of like you find your little bright spots and then you work out from there.
Definitely. And I mean, that exact scenario, the notes that are readily available on the harmonica are the ones that are probably musically most interesting over that chord anyway, because
Right.
you don't have the root and the fifth that are kind of the most bland sounding note that you could play over that chord. And I apologize to listeners if this has gotten super music geek, but that's an interesting way of thinking about it.
You've got the color notes instead of the structural notes.
Yeah, exactly. That's the perfect way to put it. Very cool. Now, I know that you have a hard out in about 5 minutes, so I don't want to take too much more of your time, but this has been really, really fantastic. I was just wondering if there's anything that you want me to anything you want to tell the audience about that you're working on, that you want to promote, any new projects?
Well, one of the things that I'm doing, I recently did a series of 3 talks on the social history of the harmonica, all of which are available. I did them live on successive Friday nights as part of something called the Virtual Film Fest. They have a Facebook page. You can find all 3 episodes there. I'm looking at possibly putting together a course doing more of this social history of the harmonica, of which there's quite an amazing amount. So that's something to maybe look forward to. Check my Facebook pages for possible announcements. My website, winslowyerxa.com, although I tend to put a lot more stuff on Facebook just because it's easier to do. And of course, we've got future things coming up with the Harmonica Collective and with the upcoming Spa Week in August. Very
cool. So I'll put links to all of that in the show notes below. And so Spa, I'm just going to very quickly end on Spa. Is it something that we can buy tickets to now? Is it ready to speak about?
Well, go to spah.org, spa.org. That's where the current announcements will be. Some people did buy their full convention ticket before we decided we needed to cancel the live event, and some of those folks have donated. Others have put it towards next year's. We're doing a variety of things that way. So just check the Facebook page too has announcements, but the best place to go really for the current information is spa.org.
Brilliant. Well, hopefully I will see you there in person next year, but I will come and see the live events online in August. And yeah, once again, thank you so much for spending some time with me today. This has been really, really interesting, and I'm probably going to ask you if I can pick your brains again about all this chromatic and jazzy and interesting harmonic content.
Sure, and we can do a follow-up session if you like.
That would be fantastic. Well, enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Tomlin, and I better get on to my other student.
No worries. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Tomlin's Harmonica Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a rating and review on your podcast player of choice. Join me next Monday for the next episode. Happy harping!